18th of August, 1944. A sweltering, fly-blown afternoon in the heart of the Normandy bocage, somewhere south of Caen. This was Operation Goodwood's bloody aftermath, a landscape of shattered villages and skeletal trees, where the border between France and hell had become hopelessly blurred. From the turret of his stationary Daimler Scout car, Major Alistair Finch of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, attached to the Guards' Armoured Division, watched the latest tragedy unfold through his field glasses. Another Cromwell cruiser tank, belonging to the Welsh Guards, brewed up not 2,000 yards away. A plume of greasy, black smoke clawed at the sky, a funeral pyre for the five-man crew inside. It was the 7th tank his workshop detachment had lost that week, all to the same unseen predator. The culprit was the Panther. German panzers, lurking in hull-down positions amidst the dense hedgerows and copses, were masters of this grim game. They were slaughtering the British Cromwells from ranges where the Cromwells were utterly impotent. The disparity was a brutal equation of physics and death. The Panther's long-barreled 7.5 cm kilowatt K-42 gun could slice through the Cromwell's frontal armor from well over a mile away. In stark contrast, the Cromwell's own 75 mm gun, a reliable but low-velocity weapon, could only hope to penetrate the Panther's thick, sloped glacis plate at suicidal ranges inside 500 yards. In practice, this meant the Panthers could sit back and pick off British armor with impunity, leaving the Cromwell crews with a horrifying choice: advance into the kill zone and pray, or reverse and be branded cowards. But Major Finch had just read something. Tucked away in a dry-as-dust technical manual, a forgotten paragraph that no one else seemed to have noticed. A detail that felt less like a footnote and more like a whispered heresy. Something that, if he was right, could change everything. The tactical responses from the British commanders had grown increasingly desperate. The official doctrine called for flanking maneuvers, sending multiple Cromwells scurrying around the sides of the beast to get a shot at its weaker side or rear armor. It was a textbook solution that rarely survived contact with reality. The cost was staggering, typically 4 or 5 Cromwells lost for every Panther knocked out. Air support from rocket-firing Hawker Typhoons, the legendary Tiffies, was devastatingly effective when the weather cooperated. But this was Normandy in late summer. A low, grey ceiling of cloud cover kept the RAF grounded more often than not. The other option was a creeping barrage from the 25-pounder guns of the Royal Artillery, a slow, methodical process that cost time and ammunition, and invariably alerted the Germans that a major push was coming. None of it addressed the fundamental, fatal imbalance. Head-to-head, at normal combat ranges, the Cromwell was simply outmatched. It was a cavalry tank, built for speed and exploitation, now being forced into a slugging match with a heavyweight predator it was never designed to fight. If you want to uncover how a dangerous, unauthorized technical gamble leveled the killing fields of Normandy, then make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Major Alistair Finch was not an engineer by trade. He was a career soldier, a ream officer with 2 decades of service under his belt, a man more comfortable with logistics reports and workshop schedules than ballistic tables. But unlike many of his peers in the armored regiments, Finch possessed a relentless, almost academic curiosity. He wasn't content just to know how a machine worked, he needed to know why. He read the technical manuals issued by the War Office cover to cover, not just the operational sections his men needed to know, but the dense chapters on metallurgy, propellant chemistry, and ballistics. He saw the tanks not just as weapons, but as complex, flawed systems, and he felt each mechanical failure and combat loss as a personal failing. The night of the 19th of August found him in his cramped caravan at the divisional headquarters near Bayeux. The air was thick with the smell of damp canvas, diesel fumes, and stale pipe tobacco. By the weak, flickering light of a hurricane lamp, Finch was hunched over Technical Manual WO-185-4, Artillery Ammunition and Propellants, Volume 2. He'd read it before, but tonight, with the image of that burning Cromwell seared into his memory, the words seemed different. On page 312, in a section detailing propellant composition, he found the paragraph. A paragraph he'd skimmed over countless times before but had never truly considered. The muzzle velocity of armor-piercing projectiles may be augmented through the addition of a supplementary accelerant, such as finely pulverized charcoal or graphite, introduced directly into the gun chamber prior to the loading of the standard cartridge case. It was the following sentence, however, that had ensured this technique remained an obscure piece of trivia. Warning: this procedure is strictly unauthorized for combat use due to extreme risks of chamber overpressurization and potential for catastrophic barrel failure. Finch read the passage 3 times, his heart beginning to thump against his ribs. He then closed the manual, took a long draw from his pipe, and made a decision that would not only defy every regulation he had sworn to uphold but would also rewrite the rules of tank warfare in Europe. He chose to ignore the warning. The physics of it all was deceptively simple. The Cromwell's armor-piercing capped, ballistic capped, APCBC, shell left the muzzle of its 75mm gun at a velocity of roughly 620 meters per second. It was this speed that dictated the shell's kinetic energy and, therefore, its ability to punch through steel. Finch reasoned that if he could increase that muzzle velocity, even by a mere 10%, the kinetic energy would increase exponentially, as energy is proportional to the square of the velocity. A 10% boost in speed would translate to a 21% increase in kinetic energy. More energy meant more penetration. More penetration meant dead Panthers at survivable ranges. But the War Office manual was unequivocal. The procedure was forbidden. The gun barrels were forged and proofed to withstand a very specific pressure curve generated by the standard cordite propellant charge. Adding an extra accelerant was like pouring petrol onto a bonfire. It could create a pressure spike that exceeded the barrel's safety margins, leading to hairline fractures, barrel warping, or, in the worst-case scenario, a cataclysmic explosion that would turn the turret into a steel coffin for the crew inside. Finch knew he had to conduct trials, but he couldn't possibly request official sanction. He'd be laughed out of headquarters, if not court-martialed for even suggesting such a reckless endangerment of men and material. So, he decided to do it unofficially. Off the books. In secret. The 20th of August, 1944. A secluded, abandoned farmstead a few miles from the front lines served as his improvised proving ground. Finch had, through some creative paperwork, requisitioned a battle-damaged Cromwell that his workshops had just finished patching up. It was due to be returned to the reserve pool, but Finch had quietly diverted it. He'd also procured 50 rounds of 75mm APCBC ammunition and, from the workshop's forge, several pounds of charcoal, which he and his most trusted NCO, Sergeant Major Davies, a grizzled Welshman with hands like shovels and a profound distrust of all officers above the rank of captain, spent an entire night grinding into a fine, black powder. Their plan was simple, if terrifying. They would load the Cromwell's gun with progressively larger measures of the charcoal powder before ramming home the standard shell. They would measure the muzzle velocity and meticulously inspect the gun for any signs of damage. Finch was no fool. He wasn't about to sit inside the tank. He and Davies rigged up a remote firing mechanism using a length of communications wire, a battery from a wireless set, and the solenoid from a Bren gun carrier starter motor. The first test, a 25-gram charge of charcoal powder. Davies tipped the small, measured pouch down the barrel, followed by the heavy brass shell. They took cover behind a thick stone wall 50 yards away. Finch touched the wires to the battery terminals. With a deafening crack, the Cromwell fired. The muzzle velocity, measured on a borrowed chronograph, was 640 meters per second. An increase of 20 meters per second, about 3% faster than standard. Finch and Davies spent the next 20 minutes inspecting the barrel with torches and dental mirrors. There were no visible signs of stress. The recoil mechanism had functioned normally. The breech block was unscratched. The second test, 50 grams of powder. The report was sharper this time. Muzzle velocity, 662 meters per second. A 6.8% increase. Again, a painstaking inspection revealed no apparent damage. The third test, 75 grams. Muzzle velocity, 691 meters per second. An increase of over 11%. This time, the bang was noticeably louder, a vicious, cracking roar that echoed across the fields. The tank rocked back on its suspension more violently. Finch's inspection of the gun chamber revealed faint heat stress marks on the steel, a slight discoloration, but no cracks, no warping. His heart was hammering. The fourth test, 100 grams. Even Sergeant Major Davies looked nervous. "That's a hefty charge, sir," he muttered, wiping sweaty palms on his overalls. Finch hesitated for a moment, the warning from the manual screaming in his mind. But then he saw the burning Cromwell again, and his resolve hardened. He nodded to Davies. The shot was apocalyptic. A violent, concussive blast that felt more like an explosion than a gunshot. The Cromwell bucked backwards a full foot, its tracks digging into the soft earth. A dense cloud of acrid black smoke poured from the muzzle. Finch ran to the tank, his hands trembling slightly as he inspected the barrel. It was almost too hot to touch. The breech showed significant heat discoloration, but there were still no cracks. No structural deformation. The velocity reading on the chronograph made his breath catch in his throat, 725 meters per second. A staggering 17% increase over the standard round. He scrambled back to his scout car and did the calculations on a notepad. A 75mm shell traveling at 725 meters per second would strike with nearly 37% more kinetic energy than a standard shell. That was it. That was the margin he needed. That was the difference between a shell bouncing harmlessly off a Panther's glacis and punching straight through it. Write Finch in the comments if you are just discovering this incredible story. But Alistair Finch needed more than just theory and numbers. He needed proof. The 21st of August. The division's salvage crews had recovered a large section of frontal armor from a knocked-out Panther tank near Cagney. It was 80mm of face-hardened steel, sloped back at 55 degrees, the very shield that had proven so impenetrable. Finch had it propped up against an earth bank, 1,000 yards from their test Cromwell. This was a typical engagement range in the rolling Normandy countryside. The first shot was a standard APCBC round, with no charcoal supplement. It streaked across the field and struck the plate with a loud clang, sparking brightly before ricocheting off into the sky, leaving behind nothing more than a shallow gouge in the paintwork. Zero penetration. The second shot was loaded with a 75-gram charge of charcoal. Estimated velocity, 691 meters per second. The shell hit the plate with a different sound, a sharp, metallic crack. Finch and Davies ran to inspect it. The result was heartening but insufficient. The shell had bitten deep into the steel, creating a deep crater and a network of fractures, but it hadn't gone through. It had penetrated perhaps 45 millimeters before being defeated. The third and final shot used the full 100-gram charge. Velocity, 725 meters per second. The impact was devastating. A brilliant white flash, a sound like a giant's hammer striking an anvil, and the massive steel plate was thrown backwards. When they reached it, they found a clean, perfectly circular hole punched straight through the 80 millimeters of sloped armor, molten steel clinging to its edges. Finch stared at it, a slow grin spreading across his face. He had found his silver bullet. 100 grams of powdered charcoal could turn the Cromwell's pop gun into a Panther killer. There was, however, one critical question left to answer. How many of these hot loads, as Davies had christened them, could a barrel withstand before it gave up the ghost? Over the next 2 days, Finch conducted a brutal endurance test. He fired the test Cromwell's gun 4 to 7 times, each with the full 100-gram charge. After every 10 shots, he would halt the test and conduct a meticulous inspection. After 20 shots, there was minor erosion of the barrel's rifling, but it was still within acceptable tolerances. After 30 shots, the erosion was more pronounced, but test shots at a target showed the accuracy was still more than adequate for combat. After the 4 to 7th shot, the rifling was significantly worn, and accuracy had degraded by about 15%. But the gun had not failed. There were no structural cracks. It was still a functional, if worn-out, weapon. Finch did a quick calculation. In a typical engagement, a Cromwell might fire between 8 and 15 armor-piercing rounds. A barrel life of 40 to 50 hot loads was more than enough. It was a trade-off he was more than willing to make. On the 23rd of August, Major Finch presented his findings to Major General Alan Adair, the commanding officer of the Guards Armored Division. The initial reaction in the command tent was one of stunned disbelief, which quickly turned to alarm. "Major, are you seriously suggesting we violate War Office technical directives and risk our own tanks exploding on the battlefield?" spluttered Major Pym, the division's senior ordnance officer, a man for whom regulations were sacred texts. Finch stood his ground, his voice calm but firm. "Sir, with respect, our tanks are already exploding. We are losing Cromwells at a rate of 5 to 1 against Panthers. If this modification allows us to kill those Panthers at 1,000 yards instead of having to close to 500, we will save infinitely more crews than we might risk from a theoretical barrel failure." General Adair was a guardsman to his core, but he was also a pragmatist. He had seen too many good men die, too many tanks burn. He looked from Pym's horrified face to Finch's determined one. "Alistair," he said quietly, "if you've found a way to level the playing field against Jerry's panzers, then by God, we'll use it. I'm authorizing a limited combat trial. 1 squadron. 10 tanks. Report back to me in 2 weeks." The 25th of August, 1944. 10 Cromwells from a squadron of the Welsh Guards were quietly modified. Each tank was issued with a sealed ammunition tin containing 5 kilograms of finely pulverized charcoal. The crews, a mixture of wary veterans and nervous replacements, were given specific, secret instructions. Before loading an APCBC round, the loader was to pour 100 grams of the black powder measured out in a pre-made scoop down the breech. They were to use this technique only against high-priority armored targets, Panthers, Tigers, or heavily fortified bunkers. The tank commanders were understandably anxious. The idea of deliberately adding extra propellant to a gun that already recoiled with bone-jarring force seemed utterly mad. But they were also tired of being outranged, tired of watching their mates burn, tired of feeling helpless. They were willing to try anything. The 28th of August, near the village of St. Martin-des-Bessaises. The first real combat test. A troop of 4 modified Cromwells, commanded by a young lieutenant named Rhys Davies, stumbled upon 2 Panthers in an ambush position, hull down behind a railway embankment, at a range of roughly 1,400 yards. Under normal circumstances, the Cromwells would have been forced to pop smoke and beat a hasty retreat or attempt a wide, suicidal flanking run. Instead, Lieutenant Rhys Davies gave a calm order over the wireless: "All stations, halt. Hot load, APCBC. Engage." The first shot came from Sergeant Evans's tank. His gunner, a corporal named Jones, laid the crosshairs on the left-hand Panther. 100 grams of charcoal powder. Range, 1,350 yards. Jones fired. The shell screamed across the intervening fields on a noticeably flatter trajectory. It struck the Panther's frontal glacis plate, just below the turret ring. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a bright flash from within the German tank, followed 3 seconds later by a catastrophic explosion as its internal ammunition cooked off, blowing the turret clean off the hull. The crew of the second Panther, stunned by the impossible shot, began traversing their turret towards Evans's tank. But they were too slow. Before they could fire, another Cromwell, commanded by Corporal Williams, sent its own hot load downrange. The shot struck the Panther's gun mantlet, penetrated, and tore through the turret interior, killing the German commander and gunner instantly. The Panzer slumped, immobilized and silent. 2 Panthers destroyed in less than a minute. 0 Cromwells lost. All from a range of over 1,300 yards. A shaken but elated Lieutenant Rhys Davies got on the wireless to Battalion HQ. His message was simple: "Finch's folly works. Repeat, Finch's folly works." Jerry never knew what hit him. Over the next 2 weeks, the 10 modified Cromwells were involved in 11 separate engagements against German Panthers. The final tally was astonishing: 9 Panthers destroyed, 2 more damaged and abandoned by their crews. Only one of the trial Cromwells was lost, and not to a gun failure, but to a direct hit from German artillery. The kill ratio had been reversed. It was now 9-1 in favor of the Cromwells. If you're still watching, you are part of history itself. Subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion to this incredible story. By early September 1944, General Adair was convinced. He issued a divisional order for all 200-plus Cromwells in the Guards Armoured Division to be equipped with charcoal provisions. The technique, now officially nicknamed Finch's Folly, was disseminated as a field modification. But then, something entirely predictable happened. Word of the unauthorized modification reached the bureaucratic labyrinth of the War Office in London. The reaction was one of institutional panic. A Colonel Wilson, head of the Artillery Development Branch, fired off an urgent and incandescent telegram to General Miles Dempsey, commander of the British Second Army. Reports indicate combat units employing unauthorized procedures in direct violation of ordnance safety specifications. Request immediate cease and desist order be issued. Dempsey, however, was a commander who valued battlefield results far more than Whitehall regulations. His reply was famously blunt. Colonel Wilson, my tanks are killing Panthers at ranges your department assured me were impossible. My crews are surviving. The modification continues until further notice. Dempsey. Wilson, incensed, persisted. He demanded formal, scientific trials be conducted at the Lulworth Ranges in Dorset to verify the procedure's safety. In October 1944, while the fighting raged on in Holland, ordnance engineers at Lulworth conducted exhaustive tests. They used brand new Cromwells with factory-fresh gun barrels. They fired 200 rounds using the 100-gram charcoal charge, meticulously measuring chamber pressures, muzzle velocities, barrel erosion, and accuracy. Their findings confirmed everything Alastair Finch had discovered in his muddy French field. The chamber pressure increased by approximately 18%. This was above the design specification, but well within the structural safety margin of the 75 mm gun barrel. Barrel erosion was roughly 2.5 times faster than with standard ammunition. A barrel that would normally be good for 1,500 rounds would last for about 600 hot loads. But since most tank barrels were replaced or destroyed long before firing 200 rounds in combat, this was deemed an acceptable cost. The risk of a catastrophic barrel explosion, based on their tests, was statistically negligible. The final report from Lulworth was cautious in its language but overwhelmingly positive in its conclusion. The Finch procedure effectively increases the penetration capability of the 75 mm gun by 35 to 40%. The associated safety risks are manageable and acceptable under combat conditions where the alternatives are significantly more lethal to our crews. By November 1944, Finch's Folly was officially sanctioned as a Class II field modification for all 75 mm gunned tanks in the European theatre. 18 tons of finely pulverized charcoal were shipped to armored units across the front. But by then, the nature of the tank war was already changing. The British were deploying the Sherman Firefly in ever greater numbers, its phenomenal 17-pounder gun capable of killing any German tank. The new Comet tank, with its potent 77 mm gun, was also beginning to arrive. Major Finch's innovation had its greatest impact in those crucial, bloody months of late summer and autumn 1944, when the Cromwell was the backbone of Britain's armoured divisions. So how many Panthers were actually destroyed using this method? Official records are incomplete, but analysis of combat reports suggests that between 60 and 90 Panthers were eliminated by tanks using this modification between August and December 1944. But far more important than the numbers was the psychological impact. German Panther crews had long operated with an arrogant confidence, a certainty that they could engage British armour from a safe distance. Suddenly, that advantage evaporated. Cromwells were now killing them at 1,200, 1,400, even 1,600 yards, ranges the Germans believed were impossible for that gun. A captured German tank commander from the 9th SS Panzer Division, interrogated near Arnhem, described the shift. In the summer, in Normandy, we could kill the Cromwells from 2 kilometers. They could not touch us. Then, In the autumn, something changed. Suddenly they were killing us from ranges we did not think possible. We did not understand. We thought perhaps they had been issued a new type of shell. Only after the war did the Germans learn of the simple trick with the charcoal. After the war, Alastair Finch was promoted to brigadier and received the Distinguished Service Order for his signal contribution to the combat effectiveness of His Majesty's Armoured Forces. The citation specifically mentioned his technical innovation and moral courage in challenging established doctrine under battlefield conditions, resulting in the preservation of countless British lives. In the 1950s, the technique of propellant boosting was formally studied and refined, leading to the development of modular charges and velocity-enhancing technologies still used in artillery today. But the most important lesson was not technical, it was cultural. Finch had ignored the warnings in the manuals because he understood that regulations are written for the controlled certainty of peacetime, not the desperate chaos of war. In combat, the greatest risk wasn't violating a technical specification, it was dying because you were afraid to try. The Germans, with their more rigid military culture, never developed an equivalent field modification. Unauthorized tinkering was severely punished. The technical manual was law. The British Army, by contrast, had a long, if sometimes exasperating, tradition of rewarding initiative and muddling through a culture of innovation born from necessity. That cultural difference was as decisive as any technological advantage. A simple trick, 100 grams of powdered charcoal, a flagrant breach of regulations, and dozens of Panthers destroyed that would otherwise have killed hundreds of British soldiers. What do you think of this incredible story? Did you know about this technical hack that leveled the playing field for British tankers? Leave us your comment below and subscribe to our channel. Every week, we bring you verified and fascinating stories of combat innovations that changed the face of war. Activate the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Because sometimes, the greatest victories don't come from following the rules,